The Andes Mountains are the longest mountain range in the world. They rise from the Caribbean coast in western Venezuela and extend thousands of kilometers south, through Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina. 7 countries tied together by the same mountains, 5 of them liberated, at least in part, by Simón Bolívar. When you climb into the Andes, the world changes around you. At first, there are dense cloud forests, immense trees shrouded in mist. But as you climb higher, the forest disappears, the temperature falls, and the air becomes thinner. Eventually, you reach the páramo, the strange, windswept landscape above the tree line and beneath the snow. At extreme elevations, there's not enough oxygen. The mind can begin to misfire. Reality becomes distorted, and delirium sets in. During Bolívar's lifetime, Chimborazo, a massive Andean volcano in modern-day Ecuador, was believed to be the highest mountain in the world. It was 1822. Bolívar had already achieved independence for Venezuela, Colombia, and Ecuador, and was preparing to march south to liberate Peru. According to legend, one night he was consumed by a feverish dream. When he awoke, he wrote a short poem, My Delirium on Chimborazo. In the poem, Bolívar imagines himself climbing the mountain, beyond the clouds and beyond the limits of ordinary men. At the summit, he encounters time, the father of the centuries, an ancient, godlike figure who challenges everything he's accomplished. Do you in madness suppose that your actions have any value in my eyes? Everything is less than a dot in the presence of the infinite, who is my brother. Bolívar is forced to confront his own insignificance. Why fight for the independence of nations if those nations will eventually disappear? Why spend an entire life pursuing glory if time will erase the memory of everyone who ever lived? For a moment, Bolívar wonders whether the violent passion that has consumed his life has all been for nothing. But then he answers, and not with humility. Surely, O time, the miserable mortal who has climbed this high must perish. I have surpassed all men in good fortune, for I have raised myself above all. The earth lies at my feet. I touch eternity with my hands. Bolívar accepts that he'll die, but he refuses to believe that his life is insignificant. His mission has raised him above ordinary men. By liberating nations, he has entered into a struggle greater than any single human life. A struggle against history itself. Nearly 2 centuries later, another Venezuelan leader would come to believe the same thing. Hugo Chávez had survived a failed coup, prison, political irrelevance, and even his removal from power. Again and again, he escaped moments that should have ended his story. And each time, he became more convinced that his survival was not an accident, but a confirmation that he had been chosen to transform Venezuela and continue Bolívar's unfinished mission. Welcome back to the Guacamaya, and this week's episode is a special one, because it's our final episode on Hugo Chávez. It's taken almost 20 episodes, but we finally made it. There's still much more to Venezuela's story to tell. This is only the end of the first act of a tragedy that continues to this day. But by now, I hope you understand the political events that defined Hugo Chávez's life, and that you've also begun to see the man behind them.
Tranquila, no te voy a molestar.
Chávez was unbelievably charismatic. He could hold the attention of supporters and enemies alike. He joked, danced, and sang. On A lo Presidente, his weekly television program, he governed, lectured, told stories, and spoke directly to the country for hours at a time.
Buenas noches, amigas y amigos. Buenas noches, compatriotas.
He was a showman everywhere he went. At the United Nations in 2006, he stood before the General Assembly, called George W. Bush the devil, and claimed that the podium still smelled of sulfur.
Ayer estuvo el diablo aquí. En este mismo lugar huele a azufre todavía.
Chávez also loved to quote writers, philosophers, and historical figures. Bolívar, Christ, Marx, Nietzsche, Martí, Galeano. He didn't study every work carefully, but he understood the force of the words. He remembered how they made him feel. and he knew how to make other people feel something too. That was one of his greatest political gifts. Chávez could take history, religion, poetry, and political theory, blend them together, and turn them into a story in which Venezuela, and Chávez himself, stood at the center of the world. But there's another thread running through Chávez's life that's impossible to ignore. He was extraordinarily lucky. His military rebellion in 1992 was a complete failure. Yet instead of disappearing into prison as another forgotten conspirator, he was given 73 seconds on national television. Those 73 seconds made him famous. He was released only 2 years later and emerged just as Venezuela's traditional political system was collapsing. Millions of Venezuelans were searching for someone who appeared to stand outside of it. And Chávez arrived at exactly the right moment. Then, in April 2002, he was removed from power.
Se designa al ciudadano Pedro Carmona Estanga, presidente de la República de Venezuela.
For a few hours, the Chávez era appeared to be over. But the people who replaced him immediately began dismantling democratic institutions, fractured the coalition against him, and ultimately helped him return to the presidency in less than 2 days. The coup that should have destroyed Chávez made him stronger. Later that year, a national strike threatened his government. When it failed, Chávez purged thousands of dissidents from the state oil company and took control of Venezuela's most important institution. Then oil prices soared. At the precise moment when he needed money to restore his popularity and survive the recall referendum, Chávez received more oil revenue than any Venezuelan president before him. Viva Venezuela! But that luck was only part of the story. Every time Chávez survived, he learned from the danger. The turmoil of the early 2000s taught him that popularity was not enough. He needed control. The armed forces were politicized and absorbed into the Bolivarian Revolution. Officers who could not be trusted were removed, while loyalists were promoted. His government also consolidated control over the courts, the electoral authority, and any other institution that might have threatened him in the future. The tactics that saved Chávez during moments of crisis became permanent pillars of the new political system. Each challenge exposed a weakness, and each victory gave him the opportunity to eliminate it. Still, institutions alone cannot explain the durability of Chavismo. At the center of everything was Chávez himself. His charisma, his conviction, and the almost mystical bond he forged with millions of Venezuelans. It would be a mistake to dismiss him as a cynical man who only wanted power. I think Chávez genuinely believed in his revolution. He believed that he embodied the will of the Venezuelan people. And once his political project became synonymous with the people, anyone who opposed it could be cast outside the nation altogether, as a traitor, an oligarch, or an agent of a foreign power.
Estos grupos violentos, terroristas y fascistas.
For Chávez, the Bolivarian Revolution, his revolution, eventually stood above the Constitution, the institutions, and even Venezuela itself. A failed coup leader had gone to prison and returned 6 years later through democratic elections. He dismantled the old political order, survived his removal from power, defeated strikes and electoral challenges, and bent the Venezuelan state to his will. From a boy raised in a house with a dirt floor to a president who spellbound the country and reshaped an entire continent, Chávez seemed touched by providence. And eventually, he began to believe that he was. That belief was not confined to political speeches. It shaped the way that Chávez understood the world. His worldview was steeped in the mystical. He spoke of omens, spirits, and signs. Catholicism mixed freely with Venezuelan folklore, the mythology of Bolívar, and Afro-Caribbean religions like Santeria. According to the people who knew him, Chávez didn't treat these beliefs as superstition. He sought guidance from them. In the book, Los Brujos de Chávez, the journalist David Placer recounts one extraordinary story. Years before the failed coup, Chávez met Cristina Marxman, the sister of his longtime lover, Irma Marxman. Cristina was a Santera witch who claimed to see the future. According to Placer, she told Chávez that he would be imprisoned, that he would become president of Venezuela, that he would later become gravely ill, and that he would die before reaching 60. By 2010, the first two predictions had already come true. That same year, Chávez's obsession with history and fascination with the spiritual world fused together into one of the most surreal spectacles of his presidency: the exhumation of Simón Bolívar. The official purpose was scientific. Chávez had long rejected the accepted explanation that Bolívar died of tuberculosis and believed that the Liberator had been poisoned by the oligarchy of his time. So in the middle of the night, Bolívar's tomb was opened. At around 3 a.m, Venezuelans watched on national television as forensic investigators removed the Liberator's remains from his sarcophagus in the national pantheon. His bones were laid beneath the Venezuelan flag. His skull was lifted from the tomb. Chávez watched from the presidential palace.
El padre Bolívar. Bolívar.
Father Bolívar. Bolívar.
Mirando el esqueleto.
Looking at that skeleton.
Mirando el cráneo. Mirando el espacio donde estuvieron los ojos.
That skull. Looking at the space where his eyes were.
Y un poco le pregunté en silencio, orando.
I asked him in silence, praying.
Le pregunté, Padre, ¿eres tú?
I asked him, Father, is that you?
¿O no eres? ¿O quién eres?
Is that you? Or who are you? Chávez didn't sound like a president observing a forensic investigation. He sounded like a disciple witnessing a resurrection. The exhumation generated darker rumors. Some claimed that Bolívar's remains had been disturbed to use his bones for spiritual rituals, binding Chávez and his revolution to the Liberator's eternal power. There's no proof that this happened, but the rumor was believable because Chávez himself had erased the boundary between politics, religion, and myth. To Chávez, Bolívar was not simply a man who had died 2 centuries earlier. He was a living force, a spirit moving through Venezuelan history, and Chávez believed that he had been chosen to bring that spirit back to life. Soon, another legend began to circulate. Several prominent figures connected, sometimes only loosely, to the exhumation died the months that followed. The coincidences became known as the Curse of Bolívar, a warning that those who disturbed the Liberator's remains would be claimed one by one. There was no evidence of a curse, but the story took hold, and the following year it acquired a new and ominous power. In May 2011, Chávez abruptly canceled part of an international tour because of an inflammation in his knee. The following month, while visiting Cuba, he underwent emergency surgery. Almost no details were released. 10 days later, Chávez appeared on television from Havana and announced that his doctors had removed a cancerous tumor.
Fue así como se detectó una extraña formación en la región pélvica que ameritó una intervención quirúrgica de emergencia.
For the next year, he traveled repeatedly between Venezuela and Cuba for chemotherapy, radiotherapy, and further operations. The government concealed almost everything about his condition, but the treatments were visibly changing him. In August 2011, Chávez appeared before the country with his head shaved and his body transformed by chemotherapy.
Es además my new look. How are you? Bien. Es un new look.
He smiled at the cameras. My new look, he joked in English. But beneath the performance, Cristina Marxman's prophecy likely hung over the president. She had predicted imprisonment and power. Now she had predicted illness and death before 60. For a man already convinced that history had chosen him, the prophecy could only reinforce the belief that his victories, his suffering, and whatever awaited him were all part of the same design. On January 29, 2012, Chávez hosted the 378th episode of Aló Presidente. It would be his last. There was no farewell and no grand conclusion. The program that had dominated Venezuelan political life for more than a decade simply disappeared. Chávez's personal stage had gone dark. He was still fighting cancer, but another presidential election was approaching, and Chávez threw everything he had into one final campaign: the power of the state, the resources of the oil boom, and his own image, everywhere. His face saturated the airwaves. Some of Venezuela's most popular artists appeared in campaign videos, singing Chávez, Corazón del Pueblo, Chávez, Heart of the People. The government also launched the Grandes Misiones. These were pensions for elderly Venezuelans who had never contributed to Social Security, subsidies to poor families with children, and above all, housing. Public housing rose across the country bearing Chávez's giant signature. Families placed their names on waiting lists for the chance that the government might one day hand them the keys to their new home. Housing became a personal promise from Chávez, and voters were repeatedly warned that the opposition would take it all away. For the first time, the opposition held a national primary and united behind a single candidate, Enrique Capriles Radonsky, the young governor of Miranda.
Aquí hay una opción que ya la conocemos, que lleva 14 años en el poder.
Capriles promised to preserve the social programs without Chávez. But Chávez had spent years making that possibility almost unimaginable. He had fused the state with the revolution, and the revolution with himself. The campaign demanded everything that his body had left. His public appearances became shorter and his absences longer. Yet he kept going. Chávez had survived prison, a coup, strikes, and elections. Now, he was determined to survive cancer too. On October 4th, 2012, he held his final campaign rally in Caracas. The skies opened up, and a torrential rain drenched the enormous crowd. His supporters didn't leave. They stood in the storm, crying for the president that they believed was the only leader who had ever truly understood them. Chávez walked onto the stage already soaked. He sang, danced, and stretched his arms towards the crowd, as if he could embrace them all. His tears disappeared into the rain. 3 days later, Chávez won once again, receiving just over 55% of the vote. He had defeated the strongest opposition candidate he had ever faced and secured another 6 years in power. But this time, victory did not restore him. On December 8th, Chávez appeared on television for the last time.
Noche a todo el pueblo venezolano.
The cancer had returned, and he was going to Cuba for another operation. For the first time, he acknowledged that he might not survive. If he could no longer continue as president, he told Venezuelans to elect Nicolás Maduro in his place.
En ese escenario, ustedes elijan a Nicolás Maduro como presidente de la República Bolivariana de Venezuela.
Then Chávez left for Cuba. He never appeared in public again. For nearly 3 months, Venezuelans waited. Government officials released contradictory reports. Supporters gathered to pray for their president. Then, on March 5, 2013, Nicolás Maduro announced that Hugo Chávez was dead. He was 58 years old. The final prediction had come true. Chávez could have stepped down when he became ill, but that was never in his nature. The same conviction that carried him to the presidential palace drove him forward, even as cancer consumed him from within. He believed that he had been chosen to alter the course of history. Only he could complete the transformation of Venezuela. Only he could lead the eternal revolution. But was this fate, or one man's delirium mistaken for destiny? That was the tragedy at the heart of Chávez's Venezuela. He began with an overwhelming popular mandate. Millions of Venezuelans believed in the future he promised. A fresh beginning, a country where the poor would finally be seen, where oil wealth would benefit everyone, and where a broken political system could be rebuilt. Chávez had the charisma to unite Venezuela, the power to reform it, and eventually more money than any Venezuelan president had ever controlled. Instead, he divided the country. He taught one half of Venezuela that they alone were the people, and that the other half were their enemies, traitors, oligarchs, obstacles standing in the path of history. He concentrated power until the state, the revolution, and Hugo Chávez became impossible to separate. Institutions existed to execute his will. The armed forces served the revolution. Social programs were presented not as rights, but as gifts delivered personally by the president. Everything depended on him, because Chávez had built a system in which only Chávez could hold everything together. That is the tragedy of Hugo Chávez. Not that he failed to change Venezuela, but what he chose to change it into. His death was not the end of that tragedy. it was only the beginning of its second act. Hugo Chávez spent his entire life trying to touch eternity, and in the end, perhaps he did. Because for more than a decade after his death, Venezuela continues to live inside the nightmare he dreamt for us. See you next week, and as always, if you want to support the show, the Patreon link is in the description.